Acid Bath by bacillus Garson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Feaster. Acid Bath. The Starway's lone watcher had experienced some odd developments in his single nerve-fraught job on the asteroid, but nothing like the weird 21-day liquid test devised by the invading steel blues. John Carl was bolting in a new baffle plate on the stationary rocket engine. It was a tedious job and took all his concentration, so he wasn't paying too much attention to what was going on in other parts of the little asteroid. He didn't see the peculiar blue spaceship, its rockets throttled down, as it drifted to land only a few hundred yards away from his plastic igloo. Nor did he see the half-dozen steel-blue creatures slide out of the peculiar vessel's airlock. It was only as he crawled out of the depths of the rocket power plant that he realized something was wrong. By then, it was almost too late. The 6 blue figures were only 50 feet away, approaching him at a lope. John Carl took one look and went bounding over the asteroid's rocky slopes in 50-foot bounds. When you're a lone watcher and strangers catch you unawares, you don't stand still. You move fast. It's the watcher's first rule. Stay alive. An Earthship may depend upon your life. As he fled, John Carl cursed softly under his breath. The automatic alarm should have shrilled out a warning. Then he saved as much of his breath as he could, as some sort of power wave tore up the rocky sward to his left. He twisted and zigzagged in his flight, trying to get out of sight of the strangers. Once hidden from their eyes, he could cut back and head for the underground entrance to the service station. He glanced back, finally. 2 of the steel-blue creatures were jackrabbiting after him, and rapidly closing the distance. John Carl unsheathed the stub-ray pistol at his side, turning the oxygen dial up for greater exertion, increased the gravity pull of his spacesuit boots as he neared the ravine he'd been racing for. The oxygen was just taking hold when he hit the lip of the ravine and began sprinting through its man-high, bush-strewn course. The power ray from behind ripped up great gobs of the sheltering bushes, but running naturally, bent close to the bottom of the ravine, John Carl dodged the bare spots. The oxygen made the tremendous exertion easy for his lungs as he sped down the dim trail, hidden from the 2 steel-blue stalkers. He eluded them, temporarily at least, John Carl decided, when he finally edged off the dim trail and watched for movement along the route behind him. He stood up, finally pushing aside the leafy overhang of a bush, and looked for landmarks along the edge of the ravine. He found one, a stubby bush shaped like a Maltese cross, clinging to the lip of the ravine. The hidden entrance to the service station wasn't far off. His pistol held ready, he moved quietly on down the ravine until the old watercourse made an abrupt hairpin turn. Instead of following around the sharp bend, John Carl moved straight ahead through the overhanging bushes until he came to a dense thicket. Dropping to his hands and knees, he worked his way under the edge of the thicket, into a hollowed-out space in the center. There, just ahead of him, was the lock leading to the service station. Slipping a key out of a leg pouch in the spacesuit, he jabbed it into the center of the lock, opening the lever housing. He pulled strongly at the lever. With a hiss of escaping air, the lock swung open. John Carl darted inside, the lock closing softly behind him. At the end of the long tunnel, he stepped to the televisor, which was fixed on the area surrounding the station. John Carl saw none of the steel-blue creatures, but he saw their ship. It squatted like a smashed-down kid's top, its lock shut tight. He turned the televisor to its widest range and finally spotted one of the steel blues. He was looking into the stationary rocket engine. As Carl watched, a second steel blue came crawling out of the ship. The 2 steel blues moved towards the center of the televisor range. They're coming towards the station, Carl thought grimly. Carl examined the 2 creatures. They were of steel-blue color from the crown of their egg-shaped heads to the tips of their walking appendages. They were about the height of Carl, 6 feet, but where he tapered from broad shoulders to flat hips, they were straight down. They had no legs, just appendages, many-jointed, that stretched and shrank independent of each other, but keeping the cylindrical body with its 4 pairs of tentacles on a level balance. Where their eyes would have been was an elliptical-shaped lens, covering half the egg head, with its converging ends curving around the sides of the head. Robots, John gauged immediately. But where were their masters? The steel blues moved out of the range of the televisor. A minute later, John heard a pounding from the station upstairs. He chuckled. They were like the wolf of pre-atomic days who huffed and puffed and blew the house down. The outer shell of the station was formed from sterilite, the toughest metal in the solar system. With the self-sealing lock of the same resistant material, a mere pounding was nothing. John thought he'd have to look-see anyway. He went to the steel ladder leading to the station's power plant and the televisor that could look into every room within the station. He heaved a slight sigh when he reached the power room, for right at his hand were weapons to blast the ship from the asteroid. John adjusted one televisor to take in the lock of the station. His teeth suddenly clamped down on his lower lip. Those steel blues were pounding holes into the sterilite with round-headed metal clubs. But it was impossible. Sterilite didn't break up that easily. John leapt to a row of studs, lining up the revolving turret which capped the station so that its thin fin pointed at the squat ship of the invaders. Then he went to the atomic cannon's firing buttons. He pressed first the yellow, then the blue button, finally the red one. The thin fin, the cannon's sight, split in half as the turret opened and the coiled nose of the cannon protruded. There was a soundless flash, then a sharp crack. John was dumbfounded when he saw the bolt ricochet off the ship. This was no ship of the solar system. There was nothing that could withstand even the slightest jolt of power given by the station's cannon on any of the sun's worlds. But what was this? A piece of the ship had changed. A bubble of metal, like a huge drop of blue wax, drifted off the vessel and struck the rocket of the asteroid. It steamed and ran in rivulets. Then he pushed the red one again. Then, abruptly, he was on the floor of the power room, his legs strangely cut up from under him. He tried to move, then lay flaccid. His arms seemed all right, and tried to lever himself in an upright position. Damn it! He seemed as if he were paralyzed from the waist down. But it couldn't happen that suddenly. He turned his head. A steel blue was facing him. A forked tentacle held a square black box. John could read nothing in that metallic face. He said, voice muffled by the confines of his plastic helmet, "Who are you?"
"I am,"
There was a rising inflection in the answer,
"a steel blue."
There were no lips on the steel blue's face to move. "That's what I have named you," John Krell said. "But what are you?"
"A robot,"
came the immediate answer. John was quite sure that the steel blue was telepathic.
"Yes," the steel blue answered. "We talk in the language of the mind. Come,"
he said peremptorily, monitoring the square black box. The paralysis left Carl's legs. He followed the steel blue, aware that the lens he'd seen in the creature's face had a counterpart on the back of the egg head. Eyes in the back of his head, John thought. That's quite an innovation.
"Thank you,"
Steel Blue said. There wasn't much fear in John Carl's mind. Psychiatrists had proved that when he'd applied for his high-paying but man-killing job as a lone watcher in the solar system's starways. He had little fear now, only curiosity. These Steel Blues didn't seem inimical. They could have snuffed out my life very simply. Perhaps they and Solarians can be friends. Steel Blue chuckled. John followed him through the sundering lock of the station. Carl stopped for a moment to examine the wreckage of the lock. It had been punched full of holes, as if it had been some soft cheese instead of a metal, which Earthmen have spent nearly a century perfecting.
"We appreciate your compliment," Steel Blue said, "but that metal also is found on our world. It is probably the softest and most malleable we have. We were surprised you, Earthmen, is it? Use it as a protective metal."
"Why are you in the system?" John asked, hardly expecting an answer. It came anyway.
"For the same reason you Earthmen are reaching out further into your system. We need living room. You have strategically placed planets for us to use. We will use them."
John sighed. For 400 years, scientists had been preaching preparedness as Earth flung her ships into the reaches of the solar system, taking the first long step towards the conquest of space. There are other races somewhere, they argued, as strong and smart as man, many of them so transcending man in mental and inventive powers that we must be prepared to strike the minute danger shows. Now, here was the answer to the scientists' warning: invasion by extraterrestrials.
"What did you say?"
asked Steel Blue.
"I cannot understand."
"Just thinking to myself," John answered. It was a welcome surprise. Apparently his thoughts had to be directed outward rather than inward in order for the Steel Blue to read it. He followed the Steel Blue into the gaping lock of the invader's spaceship, wondering how he could warn Earth. The Space Patrol cruiser was due for refueling at its service station in 21 days, but by that time he would probably be moldering in the rocky dust of the asteroid. It was pitch dark within the ship, but the Steel Blue seemed to have no trouble at all maneuvering through the maze of corridors. John followed him, attached to one tentacle. Finally, John and his guide entered a circular room, bright with light, streaming from a glass-like, bulging skylight. They apparently were near topside of the vessel. A Steel Blue, more massive than his guide and with 4 more pairs of tentacles, including 2 short ones that grew from the top of its head, spoke out.
"This is the violator."
John Steel Blue nodded.
"You know the penalty. Carry it out. He also is an inhabitant of this system,"
John's guide added.
"Examine him first, then give him the death."
John Carl shrugged as he was led from the lighted room through more corridors. If it got too bad, he still had the sub-ray pistol. Anyway, he was curious. He'd taken on the lonely, nerve-wracking job of service station attendant just to see what it offered. Here was a part of it, and it was certainly something new.
"This is the examination room,"
his Steel Blue said, almost contemptuously. A green effulgence surrounded him. There was a hiss. Simultaneously, as the tiny microphones on the outside of his suit picked up the hiss, he felt a chill go through his body. Then it seemed as if a half-dozen hands were inside him, examining his internal organs. His stomach contracted. He felt a squeeze on his heart. His lungs tickled. There were several more queer motions inside his body. Then another Steel Blue voice said,
"He is a soft metal creature, made up of metals that melt at a very low temperature. He also contains a liquid whose markup I cannot ascertain by ray probe. Bring him back when the torture is done."
John Carl grinned a little trifly. What kind of torture could this be? Would it last 21 days? He glanced at the chronometer on his wrist. John's Steel Blue led him out of the alien ship and halted expectantly just outside the ship's lock. John waited too. He thought of the sub-ray pistol holstered in his hip. Shoot my way out? It'd be fun while it lasted. But he toted up the disadvantages. He either would have had to find a hiding space in the asteroid, and if the Steel Blue wanted him bad enough, they could tear the whole place to pieces, or somehow get aboard the little life ship hidden in the service station. In that, he would just be a sitting duck. He struggled off the slight temptation to use the pistol. He was still curious. And he was interested in staying alive as long as possible. There was a remote chance he might warn the SP ship. Unconsciously, he glanced towards his belt to see the little power pack which, if under ideal conditions, could finger out 50,000 miles into space. If he could somehow stay alive the 21 days, he might be able to warn the patrol. He couldn't do it by attempting to flee, for his life would be snuffed out immediately. The Steel Blue said quietly,
"It might be ironical to let you warn that SP ship you keep thinking about, but we know your weapons now. Already our ship is equipped with a force field designed especially to deflect your atomic guns."
John Carl covered up his thoughts quickly. They can delve deeper than the surface of the mind. Or wasn't I keeping a leash on my thoughts? The Steel Blue chuckled.
"You get absent-minded, is it? Every once in a while."
Just then, 4 other Steel Blues appeared, lugging great sheets of plastic and various other equipments. They dumped their loads and began unbundling them. Working swiftly, they built a plastic igloo, smaller than the living room on the larger service station igloo. They ranged instruments inside, one of them John Carl recognized as an air pump from within the station, and they laid out a pallet. When they were done, John saw a miniature reproduction of the service station, lacking only the cannon cap and fin, and with clear plastic walls instead of the opaqueness of the other. His Steel Blue said,
"We have reproduced the atmosphere of your station so you can be watched while you undergo the torture under the normal conditions of your life."
"What is this torture?" John Carl asked. The answer was almost caressing.
"It is a liquid we use to dissolve metals. It causes joints to harden if even so much as a drop remains on it long. It eats away the metal, leaving a scaly residue which crumbles, eventually into dust. We will dilute it with a harmless liquid for you, since number 1 does not wish you to die instantly. Enter your..."
The Steel Blue hesitated.
"Mausoleum. You die in your own atmosphere. However, we took the liberty of purifying it. There were dangerous elements in it."
John walked into the little igloo. The Steel Blues sealed the lock, fingered dials and switches on the outside. John's spacesuit deflated. Pressure was building up in the igloo. He took a sample of the air, found it was good, although quite rich in oxygen compared to what he'd been using in the service station in his suit. With a sigh of relief, he took off his helmet and gulped huge draughts of air. He sat down on the pallet and waited for the torture to begin. The Steel Blues crowded about the igloo, staring at him through elliptical eyes. Apparently, they too were waiting for the torture to begin. John thought the excess of oxygen was making him lightheaded. He stared at a cylinder which was beginning to sprout tentacles from the center. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. An opening, like the adjustable eyepiece of a space scope, was appearing in the center of the cylinder. A square glass-like tumbler sat in the opening, disclosed a 4-foot cylinder that had sprouted tentacles. It contained a yellowish liquid. One of the tentacles reached into the opening and clasped the glass. The opening closed, and the cylinder, propelled by locomotor appendages, moved towards John. He didn't like the looks of the liquid in the tumbler. It looked like an acid of some sort. He raised to his feet. He unsheathed the subray pistol and prepared to blast the cylinder. The cylinder moved so fast John felt his eyes jump in his head. He brought the subray gun up, but he was helpless. The pistol kept on going up. With a deft movement, one of the tentacles had speared it from his hand and was holding it out of his reach. John kicked at the glass in the cylinder's hand, but he was too slow. 2 tentacles gripped the kicked leg. Another struck him in the chest, knocking him to the pallet. The same tentacle, assisted by a new one, pinioned his shoulders. 4 tentacles held him supine. The cylinder lifted a glass-like cap from the tumbler of liquid. Lying there helplessly, John was remembering an old fairy tale he'd read as a kid. Something about a fellow named Socrates, who was given a cup of hemlock to drink. It was the finish for Socrates, but the old hero had been nonchalant and calm about the whole thing. With a sigh, John Carl, who was curious unto death, relaxed and said, "All right, bub, you don't have to force-feed me. I'll take it like a man." The cylinder apparently understood him, for it handed him the tumbler. It even reholstered his subray pistol. John brought the glass of liquid under his nose. The fumes of the liquid were pungent. It brought tears to his eyes. He looked at the cylinder, then at the Steel Blues crowding into the plastic goo. He waved the glass at the audience. "To Earth, ever triumphant," he toasted. Then he drained the glass in a gulp. It was bitter, and he felt hot prickles jab at his scalp. It was like eating very hot peppers. His eyes filled with tears. He coughed as the stuff went down. But he was still alive. He thought in amazement. He'd drunk the hemlock and was still alive. The reaction set in quickly. He hadn't known until then how tense he'd been. Now, with the torture ordeal over, he relaxed. He laid down on the pallet and went to sleep. It was one lone Steel Blue watching him when he rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and sat up. He vanished almost instantly. He, or another like him, returned immediately, accompanied by a half-dozen other, including the multi-tentacled creature known as Number One. One said,
"You are alive."
The thought registered amazement.
"When you lost consciousness, we thought you had,"
There was a hesitation.
"as you say, died."
"No," John Carl said. "I didn't die. I was just plain dead beat, so I went to sleep." The Steel Blues apparently didn't understand.
"Good it is that you live. The torture will continue,"
spoke Number One before loping away. The cylinder business began again. This time, John drank the bitter liquid slowly, trying to figure out what it was. It had a familiar, tantalizing taste, but he couldn't quite put a taste finger on it. His belly said he was hungry. He glanced at his chronometer. Only 20 days left before the SP ship arrived. Would this torture, he chuckled, last until then? But he was growing more and more conscious that his belly was screaming for hunger. The liquid had taken the edge off his thirst. It was on the 5th day of his torture that John Carl decided he was going to get something to eat or perish in the attempt. The cylinder sat passively in its niche on the circle. A dozen Steel Blues were watching as John put on his helmet and unsheathed his stub ray. They merely watched as he pressed the stub ray's firing stud. Invisible rays licked out of the bulbous muzzle of the pistol. The plastic splintered. John was out of the goldfish bowl and striding towards his own igloo adjacent to the service station when a Steel Blue accosted him. "Out of the way," John grunted, waving the stub ray. "I'm hungry."
"I'm the first Steel Blue you met,"
said the creature who barred his way.
"Go back to your torture."
"But I'm so hungry, I'll chew off one of your tentacles and eat it without seasoning."
"Eat?"
The Steel Blue sounded puzzled. I want to refuel. I've got to have food to keep my engine going. Steel Blue chuckled.
So the hemlock, as you call it, is beginning to affect you at last. Back to the torture room.
Like our dust, John growled. He pressed the firing stud on the stub ray gun. One of the Steel Blue's tentacles broke off and fell to the rocky sward. Steel Blue jerked out the box he'd used once before. A tentacle danced over it. Abruptly, John found himself standing in a pinnacle of rock. Steel Blue had cut a swath around him 15 feet deep and 5 feet wide.
Back to the room,
Steel Blue commanded. John resheathed the sub-ray pistol, shrugged noncommittally, and leapt the trench. He walked slowly back and re-entered the torture chamber. The Steel Blues rapidly repaired the damage he'd done. As he watched them, John was still curious, but he was getting mad underneath at the cold egotism of the Steel Blues. By the shimmering clouds of Earth, by her green fields and dark forests, he'd stay alive to warn the SP ship. Yes, he'd stay alive until then, and send the story of the Steel Blues' corrosive acid to it. Then hundreds of Earth ships could equip themselves with spray guns and squirt citric acid and watch the Steel Blues fade away. It sounded almost silly to John Carl. The fruit acid of Earth to repel these invaders. It doesn't sound possible. That couldn't be the answer. Citric acid wasn't the answer, John Carl discovered a week later. The Steel Blue who had captured him in the power room of the service station came in to examine him.
You're still holding out, I see,
he observed after poking John in every sensitive part of his body.
I'll suggest to number one that we increase the power of the, hemlock. How do you feel?
Between the rich oxygen and the dizziness of hunger, John was a bit delirious. But he answered honestly enough. My guts feel as if they're chewing each other up. My bones ache. My joints creak. I can't coordinate, I'm so hungry.
That is the hemlock,
Steel Blue said. It was when he qualified the new and stronger joke that John knew that his hope that it was citric acid was squelched. The acid taste was weaker, which meant that the citric acid was the diluting liquid. It was the liquid he couldn't taste beneath the tang of the citric acid that was the corrosive acid. On the 14th day, John was so weak he didn't feel much like moving around. He let the cylinder feed him the hemlock. Number one came to see him again and went away chuckling.
Decrease the dilution. This Earthman is at last beginning to suffer.
Staying alive now had become a fetish with John. On the 16th day, the Earthman realized that the Steel Blues also were waiting for the SP ship. The extraterrestrials had repaired the blue ship where the service station's atomic ray had struck, and they were doing a little target practice with plastic bubbles only a few miles above the asteroid. When his chronometer clicked off the beginning of the 21st day, John received a tumbler of the hemlock from the hands of number one himself.
It is the hemlock,
he chuckled.
Undiluted. Drink it and your torture is over. You will die before your SP ship is destroyed. We have played with you long enough. Today we begin to toy with your SP ship. Drink up, Earthman. Drink to enslavement.
Weak though he was, John lunged to his feet, spilling the tumbler of liquid. It ran cool along the plastic arm of his spaceship. He changed his mind about throwing the contents on number one. With a smile, he set the glass to his lips and drank. Then he laughed at number one. The SP ship will turn your ship into jelly. Number one swept out, chuckling.
Boast if you will, Earthman. It's your last chance.
There was an exultation in John's heart that deadened his hunger and washed away the nausea. At last he knew what the hemlock was. He sat on the pallet adjusting the little power pack radio. The SP ship should now be within range of the set. The Space Patrol was notorious for its accuracy in keeping to schedule. Seconds counted like years, but they had to be on the nose, or it meant disaster or death. He sent out the call letters. AX to SP-101, AX to SP-101, AX to SP-101. 3 times he sent the call, then began sending his message, hoping that his signal was reaching the ship. He couldn't know if they answered. Though the power pack could get out a message over a vast distance, it could not pick up messages even when backed by an SP ship's power, unless the ship was only a few hundred miles away. The power pack was strictly a distress signal. He didn't know how long he'd been sending, or how many times his weary voice had repeated the short but desperate message. He kept watching the heavens and hoping. Abruptly he knew the SP ship was coming, for the blue ship of the Steel Blues was rising silently from the asteroids. up and up it rose. Then flames flickered in a circle from its curious shape. The ship disappeared, suddenly accelerating. John Carl strained his eyes. Finally, he looked away from the heavens to the two steel blues who stood negligently outside the goldfish bowl. Once more, John used the stub ray pistol. He marched out the plastic igloo and ran towards the service station. He didn't know how weak he was until he stumbled and fell only a few feet from his prison. The steel blues just watched him. He crawled on, around the circular pit on the sward of the asteroid where one steel blue had shown him the power of his weapon. He'd been crawling through a nightmare for years when the quiet voice penetrated his dulled mind. Take it easy, Carl. You're among friends. He pried open his eyes with his will. He saw the blue and gold of a Space Guard's uniform. He sighed and drifted into unconsciousness. He was still weak days later when Captain Ron Small of SP-101 said, "Yes, Carl, it's ironical. They fed you what they thought was sure death, and it's the only thing that kept you going long enough to warn us." "I was dumb for a long time," Carl said. "I thought that it was the acid, almost to the very last. But when I drank that last glass, I knew they didn't have a chance. They were metal monsters. No wonder they feared that liquid. It would rust their joints, short their wiring, and kill them. No wonder they stared when I kept alive after drinking enough to completely annihilate a half dozen of them." "But what happened when you met the ship?" The space captain grinned. "Not much. Our crew was busy creating a hollow shell filled with water to be shot out of a rocket tube converted into a projectile thrower. Those steel blues, as you call them, put traction beams on us and started tugging us towards the asteroid. We tried a couple of atomic shots, but they just glanced off. We gave up. They weren't expecting the shell of water. When it hit the blue ship, you could almost see it oxidize before your eyes. I guess they knew what was wrong right away. They let go the traction beams and tried to get away. They forgot about the force field, so we just poured atomic fire into the weakened ship. It just melted away." John Carl got up from the divan where he'd been lying. "They thought I was a metal creature too. But where do you suppose they came from?" The captain shrugged. "Who knows?" John set two glasses on the table. "Have a drink of the best damn water in the solar system," he asked Captain Small. "Don't mind if I do." The water twinkled in the two glasses, winking as if it knew just what it had done. This is the end of Acid Bath by Vasilov Garson. This has been a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Feaster. Acid Bath by Vasilov Garson. This is a LibriVox recording.